Welcome back to the Believe Fantasy Football Show with your pal, it's Fabs. And boy, do I have a treat for you. Not only am I going to be talking about the what's what in fantasy football, but of course we got Toss here as well. We brought in the legendary king, the man who is more synonymous with fantasy football than maybe anybody on the planet, the hardest working man in the industry, Bob Harris, Football Diehards, SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio. What is up, my friend? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Fabs. It was a kind intro, but no lies were detected. Absolutely 100% honest assessment, sir.
Well done, man. As always, you can find Bob over at Football Diehards on SiriusXM and on X at Football Diehards. How about that? Now it's X. It's like the Redskins are no longer the Redskins. They were the football team, and now they're not the football team. They're the Commanders. And now Twitter is no longer Twitter. It's X.
It's that place I work a lot. That's what I call it.
So, anyways, I always make a joke about X. A lot to talk about here, Bob. This is the weekend when most people are doing their drafts, or at least a pretty good percentage of people are doing their drafts. We got all the news that we need, and we continue to get more. And the most recent bit of news, which to me is troubling, is that Cooper Kupp had a setback in his return from a hamstring injury, and he is now considered day-to-day, according to Sean McVay. I know I dropped Cooper Kupp in my rankings at wide receiver. Where did you drop Cooper Kupp, if at all? And at what point now do you feel comfortable drafting him?
I did drop him. He's been my wide receiver one. I love that consistent average weekly scoring over the last 2 seasons when he's been on the field. I am also injury agnostic, so I don't fear players who have been hurt getting hurt again. But I'm not stupid. I don't like to draft players who are already injured. Not the best course of action. I've dropped him down to wide receiver 4 for now. I know my buddy Dwayne McFarland put out a tweet that I thought, or next, that was pretty interesting. He took off his projections 2 games and lowered the target share a little bit, and Kupp still finished as wide receiver 12 in his model. So I'm still comfortable drafting him and maybe taking the value and hoping, but there's a risk involved. Maybe I would prefer him to be my second receiver if I'm drafting receiver early and he slips down into round 2 somehow. And people might shy away. Would not be surprising if they did. And honestly, I wouldn't blame them, but I'm thinking about everything we do right now. I'm thinking, what are we going to be talking about in October? Is this going to be the story in October? Is it going to be his hamstring? Maybe, but not certainly. So I think there's a point where the gamble becomes, at least the desired outcome is worth the risk.
See, I'm a chicken. I dropped him to 10 at wide receiver because it's a soft tissue injury. It's not getting better. He was hurt for half of last year. The Rams suck. Their offense is going to be terrible. I know how great he is. Listen, man, if I knew I was getting 15 games from Cooper Kupp, I'm putting him in my top 3 among wide receivers, top 4 at worst. But this thing has the potential to linger, and I'm not saying I wouldn't draft him. I don't think Cooper Kupp is a first-round pick right now. I just don't. It's too much risk involved. Hamstrings are funny. You know that, Bob. I mean,
sure.
These things can linger, and I don't know how much time he's going to miss. Like McVay talked about how they want to get him right, not for in terms of like the physical part of it, but actually being able to play football effectively without any limitations. So I don't know how long that's going to take. So would I draft him still? I mean, probably, yeah, but like he's not a first round pick for me right now. Yeah, I'd rather go the safer route and take other players who I know are healthy, who I know reasonably that I'm going to have some pretty high end scoring from them on a week in and week out basis.
Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, honestly, you it depends on your own personal level of risk tolerance. And I know, mine is much greater. I'm willing to take more risk because what's going to happen at the end of the year? No one's going to remember if I lost the league. Only people are only going to remember if I win the league. So taking some risk is, swinging big is probably more my tendency. But that said, and I say this all the time, Fabs, you can have risk on your roster without having a risky roster. You can build safer players around him and build depth differently when you take some chances at the top. But ideally, taking chances at the top is not necessarily the route to take. So if you're out there and you're in a single league, totally get it. If you want to dial back from Cooper Kupp, makes perfect sense.
And then we got, of course, the news on Jonathan Taylor. 4 games and maybe he comes back. And if he does come back, will it be for the Colts? We're not sure. Jonathan Taylor, in 2 drafts that I've seen, 10-team league, 9th round pick, 12-team league, SI mock draft, which you can find at si.com/fantasy, 7th round pick. You comfortable drafting him in that range, or is he just off your board?
Again, roster construction is going to matter. I wouldn't be against taking him as my 3rd running back if I feel like I have 2 really solid players ahead of him at the position. So that's where I've dropped him down into my rankings outside the top 24, down into the 30s, I would say. And like there's enough uncertainty here where I feel like this is a big risk. But is it a ton more uncertainty? I mean, we see Javonte Williams on the field, but talking to people in Denver last night. The talk is that they'll probably be cautious with him coming back, even though he's not opening up pup. Same issue with Breece Hall. I mean, so you're taking some chances with those guys. I feel like it seems like the injury component of this is probably more part of the negotiations than actual injury. This seems just my sense of it. So we'll see. But you're missing 4 games, so drop him down below the range you would take Alvin Kamara due to the uncertainty. He's going to miss 3 games, so just kind of doing those kind of calculations. But don't draft him unless you have like 2 really solid options at the position ahead of him.
Think about how the running back position has gotten a kick in the nuts, like for the last couple of months. Think about it. The Jets signed Alvin Cook, and we have to slow our roll on Breece Hall. The Patriots signed Zeke, and I still like Ramondre Stevenson, but I mean, you'd be stupid to think that his ceiling didn't take a hit, especially in the touchdown department with Zeke in the mix. Jonathan Taylor now is out for 4 games. We're not sure when he's coming back, so he's dropped down. I mean, running back has really taken it tough over the last month or so, and those are just a few of the examples. We're seeing more and more committee situations in Philadelphia. I don't know who's going to be the guy there. It could be Gainwell one week, could be Swift the next week, could be Penny the next week. So that's why we're seeing running backs falling in drafts. And I've talked about the 0 RB strategy. And to be honest with you, before this year, I hated it. I hated it. Why would I ignore the best running backs in fantasy football, the most important position in fantasy football? Well, now it's not the most important position in fantasy football. It's the wide receivers. And because wide receivers are going so high, and you're seeing Kelsey going around 1, and you're seeing Andrews going around 2 or 3, you're seeing 3 or 4 quarterbacks go in the first 3 to 4 rounds. Running backs now are more valuable in rounds 4, 5, 6, and 7 than they ever were before. So are you into the 0 RB strategy, Bob? Is that a philosophy that you've sort of taken in, or does it kind of depend on the flow of the draft?
It depends on the flow of the draft, what draft position I have. And also, there's a little bit of zigging when everyone else is zagging kind of situation here. There's still some really good guys at the top end of the draft. Look, we're drafting everyone in the first round at their ceiling, right? So know that, and know there might be some disappointments involved, but those running backs at the top, those sure workload running backs, I'm not against, having an anchor top end running back. That said, I've built lots of rosters starting out with either 2 receivers, a tight end and a receiver. I've started rosters with 2 wide receivers, a receiver, tight end, and then a quarterback. So, and all those builds have worked because of exactly what you said. What we used to call the dead zone of running backs, that group from around 17, 18 down, just maybe starting with Kenneth Walker goes down through Madison. There's a whole range of them. James Conner, I'm a big fan of just for anticipated workload. Lousy offense. Dameon Pierce, lousy offense, but expect a pretty good workload there. James Cook is down there in a really good offense. So there's a wide range of players available in that, rounds 5 through 8 range that I'm willing to go with just based on volume alone.
And if you don't know what the 0 RB strategy is, you don't draft a running back in the first 5 rounds. You go with the wide receivers, maybe a tight end, a quarterback, for example. Then you start eating up the running back position. And I've used it, and I have hated it in the past, but this year it seems like it makes more sense to do it. If I have a flex position, I want that flex position to be filled by a wide receiver if I can do that. Toss, what about you? Have you had any drafts so far where you've used 0 RB? I know we've got a draft coming up this upcoming week, I think Wednesday, where a bunch of us from the Believe Podcast Network are going to battle it out, including Chris Johnson, CJ2K, Lendell White, and some others. What strategy are you using?
I don't mind the 0 RB strategy, but it all has to do with what happens in the first and second round for me. Because, that's where I'm targeting guys, of course, if I'm top end pick of the first round, McCaffrey and Eckler are interesting to me, and then that changes things. Of course, I'm not going with the zero RB strategy, but if I end up with 3 stud wide receivers, okay, I can mix and match Rashad White and Cam Akers, who I know is going to get a lot of volume this year. David Montgomery, who still is, his ADP is way too low in my opinion, given what we saw with Jamal Williams' effectiveness in the red zone last year. And I'm cool with kind of piecemealing just my running back room, but making sure that if you do go with that zero RB strategy, you do need to take between round 6 and 10, 2 or 3 running backs at the bare minimum. If you're in a full point PPR, I mean, I'm just in love with Jerrick McKinnon, and he's so low on the board. Like, why wouldn't you just stash that guy?
Double-digit round.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could get him late. Yeah, McKinnon's a guy I've been targeting. Ken Gainwell's a guy I've been targeting also. I seem to be getting a bunch of shares of them. I mean, even P. Ryan. And P. Ryan's going round 7, round 8, round 9, depending on the size of your league. And I wouldn't be surprised if you had like a 50-50 split in that backfield with Javonte Williams playing more of the pass-catching role and P. Ryan being more of the grinder. That could absolutely happen. I mean, we saw that in Denver the last few years with Melvin Gordon and Javonte. So P. Ryan's also in that mix too. And again, it's a weird world for me. It's like the bizarro world, man. It's dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. I never have ever done this before, but I'm giving it a shot this year. I'm not going completely zero RB. I'm also going hero RB. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, folks, but hero RB means you draft one running back, which is your hero, and then you start loading up on wide receivers, tight ends, et cetera, in the first 5 rounds. Bob, have you used that philosophy? And honestly, I think that philosophy works better in a 12 and 14 team league. And a 10 team league, I can get away with going zero RB and still get really good running backs. In 12 teamers and 14 teamers, it might be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I tend to feel the same way. And I mean, that doesn't mean you can't get a receiver in the first round, but come around to the second round, there's still some of those really high-end, high-volume running backs. I know, a guy that, Josh Jacobs was one who was falling into the third round. We'll talk about him, but he's rising back up. But players like Derrick Henry, towards the tail end of the second round, I'm not averse to that because I don't fear him falling off the cliff, but I'm chasing that volume. And I think that's, that's the thing I'm after is guys that I feel are going to get certain volume, but that whole range down lower, I feel really confident in their volume as well. So I've kind of, like, we sit here and we have the benefit. I've done well over 100 drafts, right? And so I'm at the point where, I'm shifting from best ball mode to redraft mode where, I'm trying to keep in my mind, I have a single draft. And so I know most of the listeners out there are probably saying the same thing. I'm just going into one draft. So I do think it's worthwhile to say, like, if I was doing this one draft, I'd probably feel more comfortable with that anchor or hero RB, as you said. Whether I get him in the first or second round, though, is the difference. And I can still have that receiver heavy build that's so desirable. You mentioned something about the receivers being flex. I used to have a saying that I used for many years. The first law of flexology is feature back over a wide receiver in the flex. Well, I don't say that anymore because there's no feature backs that filter down to the flex level anymore. There's just not that many. There used to be a time when there was, 20 plus feature backs and you could work that out. You can't do that anymore. The NFL it's a new landscape, and the number of backs who handle that kind of workload are very limited. So getting one of those is like the hero or the anchor makes perfect sense to me. And you could still get those super freak wide receivers up at the top as well.
Taz, did you hear him, by the way? 100 drafts. This is an engaged man. I don't know how he found a woman who would marry him while he's doing 100 fantasy drafts during the summer months. But that is a lot. That's why I said Bob Harris is the busiest man in the business, man.
Was she in any of those leagues with you?
She is not. She's a big football fan, but not so much the fantasy. But also a very busy schedule, so it works out well. But to be honest, I started drafting in February, right? The best ball rooms open in February, so it's not hard to get well up over 100 if you're doing a few a week since then. So, but also I think it's kind of what the goal is here is to be steeped in it, and when you're sitting here in your final drafts coming down the stretch, I have pretty good comfort level in what players are going to go where, and something about ADP I wanted to mention. You don't need to be a prisoner to ADP. ADP is not when you have to draft players. It's when players are getting drafted. If you want them, you might have to go ahead of ADP. So don't feel like you're trapped in there, or as you're in the whatever site, whatever platform you're drafting on, you're going to be presented with players in an ADP list. Don't feel bound by that. It's not a rule book, people. It's just that's how they present them. first thing you want to do when you go into your draft is scroll down that list and find some outlier players that you're keen on, or find players that aren't positioned where you want them, move them over into your queue so you have them ready and you're ready to pounce. Jerrick McKinnon would be a prime example of a guy I look for right away when I get in my queues. I know he's going to be way down the list, and I want to have him on my radar so I don't miss out on him. And I know when he's been going, so I know when I have to draft him, because I'm not a prisoner of ADP.
Yeah, I've got a lot of McKinnon shares too. Speaking of preseason, and of course, preseason, we didn't learn a lot. We learned a little bit. What players did you learn the most about in terms of their usage? Was there any players that you learned a little bit about their usage? What players moved up or moved down based on preseason, based on training camp reports for you, Bob, that maybe were a little bit lower or higher in your rankings before August?
I think quarterback, one of the guys you like, Kenny Pickett, has moved up. Considerably. The offense just looks better. I'm not pinning all my hopes on exhibition play because not everyone's game planning. The defenses aren't all, as robust, but he looks like he's ready to make a step, and he has great weapons around him. I think the other piece of that offense that people have an eye on is Jaylen Warren. Creating a lot of buzz. He goes down on the lower end of the running backs that you can take and maybe have some hope of, maybe something more than just like avoiding zeros when you get into the bye weeks, etc. So I like both of those players. The other quarterback I think that's risen is Sam Howell. People have a lot of confidence, harkening back to his time in college. A great runner there, so I think people are starting to feel a little comfortable. And again, a good supporting cast, and one of those guys rising also, Jahan Dotson, you're seeing rise up. I think Tony Pollard people are getting more comfortable with the notion of him as a running back one, and drafting him as, like, if you're drafting an anchor or a hero and you're waiting until the second round, he's usually waiting there for you. If you're drafting towards the tail end of the second round, you get a high-end wide receiver and then come back and get him. And I mean, there's his range of outcomes is the high end is pretty high, right? I know multiple analysts out there have projected him as their running back one overall. I'm not one of those, but I could see it. They can make a pretty strong case for it. At tight end, Darren Waller has risen up the ranks for me. I've moved him up to number 3 just based on anticipated volume. No offense to DJ Hawkinson, but there's 4 or 5 guys there that can cut into his workload. And he was heavily targeted last season when he was there, and Minnesota passes 65% of the time. So, I'm not dismissing him, but I think Darren Waller has that path to wide receiver 1 type workload, and I love him going there. Jahmyr Gibbs, as you know, Michael Fabiano, if I am a hammer, he is my nail. And I feel like I'm personally responsible for driving his ADP up in many of those drafts I've been in. I liked him a whole lot as 4th round Jahmyr Gibbs. I still like him as 3rd round Jahmyr Gibbs. I'm liking him a little less as 2nd round Gibbs, but that's where he's heading. But people see what that offense did last year in Detroit. If you're thinking Bijan Robinson is a locked in 1st round pick based on draft capital, based on he's running behind a decent offensive line, based on just, the draft capital invested mostly. Well, Jahmyr Gibbs with 4 picks later, people running behind a better offensive line and a more explosive offense. I know David Montgomery is there, and I think he's still going to have great value, but I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to have a huge receiving role in this offense. We saw it with DeAndre Swift, a player they did not trust, and yet still was pretty productive when he was on the field.
Let's just hope that he avoids the curse of Barry Sanders, as you like. I like.
Stop with your curses.
Listen, man, every running back they've drafted in the first 3 rounds since Sanders retired has not lived up to expectations, gotten hurt, or both. I'm just saying, if he goes out there and gets hurt or has issues with his statistical success, and David Montgomery is better than we all anticipate, maybe gets a little bit more burn than we all anticipate, then I can sit back and say, I told you so. I am not avoiding Jahmyr Gibbs, but I don't want him in the 3rd round. If I got to take him in the 3rd round, I'm probably not going to draft him. And 4th round, like you said, Jahmyr Gibbs, I'm fine with that. Certainly got a lot more confidence in Bijan Robinson among the top 2 rookie running backs, and I think that's the case for just about everybody out there.
Don't make me throw Clyde Edwards-Helaire in your face, Michael Fabiano.
Hey, listen, I will contend that Clyde Edwards-Helaire was good for the first 6 games before they signed Le'Veon Bell, and they screwed the whole thing up. And I wasn't the only one who liked him, by the way, Bob Harris. That was just a disaster of a pick. What's crazy about that is when I went back and looked at Andy Reid and his offenses, he had so many running backs who were successful. Brian Westbrook, Deuce Staley, Jamal Charles, Kareem Hunt. And he always liked to use, when he had one, he would use the featured back. And you draft a guy at the end of the 1st round, I thought they'd use him. And now, hell, I don't even know what to do with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's the third guy on that totem pole in Kansas City, and he's getting picked as a late round flyer, if at all.
He's your 20th round pick in best balls right now. He's one of those. He's on that list of guys. But that goes back to something I said, Michael. Is that we're drafting everyone at their ceiling in round one, including Bijan Robinson. The only difference between Bijan and the other guys we're drafting at their ceiling is we've seen their ceiling. We haven't seen Bijan, and I'm not knocking him. I'm drafting him in the first round when I'm drafting him if he falls in the right spot for me. But we're taking a little bit of a leap of faith with players we have not seen play in the NFL. And look, Arthur Smith, an innovative offensive mind. He twisted up the Rubik's Cube of talents that Cordero Patterson presents and turned it into a thing. And good for him. But what has he done for Kyle Pitts? What did he do for Drake London? He has not done as great of things for them. And I'm hoping for the best. I'm just saying there's again, looking at the range of possible outcomes, we have not yet seen that ceiling yet for Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, and I think a part of it is the quarterback position with Atlanta, whether it was Matt Ryan, who was at the end of his career, and boy, he was bad last year for the Colts when he played, and Mariota, guys like Pitts. I mean, the targets that they're getting are not all that great. He's right up there at the top in terms of the tight ends and catchable passes that were thrown. He didn't see as many of the other players at the position. So harder for him to put up numbers, and the same thing goes for Drake London. So we've got a few quarterbacks that we're kind of hoping can pan out for our fantasy players, not necessarily for their own individual value. Although I do think Sam Howell is one of those guys, mobile quarterback. I like what I saw in the preseason. He's going to be fun to watch. Got a good matchup in week 1 against Arizona, so you're going to want to potentially start him if you need a quarterback. But let's talk about Desmond Ridder. And we don't know anything about these guys.
Right.
I mean, they've barely played, if they've played at all in the NFL. We don't know anything about these guys. Ridder, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud. We've got a lot of question marks at the quarterback position that are ultimately going to have an effect on the players that we draft. And some of them are going to be drafted highly, like a Drake London in Atlanta, for example. At what point does the questions at a team's quarterback position keep you from drafting a player, or make you decide, you know what, I'm going to see if he's available in a round or two, and if he's not, well, I'll have just passed on him and I'm fine with it?
All these things that we're doing, all these decisions we're making in fantasy, including like Bijan, and based on his quarterback, we're weighing odds, and we're considering probabilities of outcomes, right? We don't know the outcomes, and so the quarterback definitely has to be a factor in those. And in Desmond Ridder's case, it's not a positive factor. I think, look, it's not going to keep me from drafting Bijan Robinson. The quarterback situation, again, you look at the draft capital invested, you're going to expect that solid workload, but that doesn't mean Tyler Algier goes away or some of the other pieces go away. So you have to take all that into account, including the quarterback. Some of those other quarterbacks, CJ Stroud, I've not seen a lot at the NFL level yet, but I'm hoping he grows, and even the worst offenses do generate some, especially if they're not playing great defense. Maybe DeMeco Ryans puts together a better defense than we expect, and they just go totally run heavy, or they go run heavy to keep the opposing offense off the field. So I have concerns about him. My concerns about Bryce Young center mostly on the offensive line. I think he'll be just fine, but the quarterback's definitely a factor. But I think it comes down to the point where you're kind of splitting hairs. And I think in most cases, like you look at Nico Collins, the perceived wide receiver 1, you're getting him close to the double digits or into the double digit rounds in drafts. There's a reason why. It's baked into the ADP in most cases. So make your adjustments if you're more confident and you think he's more likely to outproduce that level of those expectations despite his quarterback, or maybe because of his quarterback, right? But, some of the players we're drafting totally because of their quarterbacks, or at least in large part because of their great quarterbacks. Yeah. So it goes both ways. Yeah,
exactly. Any chief wide receiver, we all know what we're getting out of Kelsey. No question about that. So let's talk about the rookie tight ends real quick before we wrap up the show today, because that position, we talked about players whose value is on the rise. Sam Laporta, Luke Musgrave, Michael Mayer. I haven't heard right or wrong, good or bad about him in camp, but I mean, he's got a shot to be the guy for Vegas, with only Austin Hooper there. And then, let's not forget about Dalton Kincaid, who to me is probably the best rookie tight end prospect from a fantasy perspective for this initial season. What do you think about these players? Because when I look at the group and I'm thinking, okay, they're in a good situation, or they've got a good quarterback, or both. And then I go back in my head and I think, wait a minute, rookie tight ends typically don't know anything. And what makes this group different? Is there in your mind one player who stands out above the rest in that quartet? And are you playing it safe with the rookie tight ends, or are you thinking, hey, I could be aggressive here? Sam Laporta's getting a lot of positive press. I'm going to go out and get him maybe a round or two higher than I would otherwise.
As long as Tyler Higbee exists, he's going to get 100 plus targets and be available late in drafts. I can take a chance on one of those young up and comers and maybe play the upside, right? We do that a lot of quarterbacks, but take a chance, maybe draft that Anthony Richardson ahead of ADP because there's going to be a really solid quarterback you can count on week in, week out. So if that's the case, I'm willing to take a chance on. I think you mentioned Dalton Kincaid. I think he's most interesting because he's probably not going to play a lot of tight end, right? Or at least traditional tight end. He's going to work in the slot, and that's a big role in the Buffalo offense, and probably a big reason why they landed him and moved up to do it, right? So I think there's something to be said for that, and a great quarterback as well. Laporta, I think he's fine also as like an upside play. I think some of the younger, there's other unproven guys that I know people are concerned about Greg Dulcich's usage because they see a lot of Adam Troutman in the preseason in Denver. But you listen to people, Peter Schrager on NFL Network, who's buddies with Sean Payton, spent 5 minutes talking about the upside of Greg Dulcich. I don't think that was an accident. I talked to Parker Gabriel from the Denver Post last night. He also could not stop raving about the Greg Dulcich, and so just thinks his skill set is ideally suited to what Sean Payton wants to do to create mismatches. So I'm looking for those kind of things. But of the rookies, those are the two. It's Kincaid and then Laporta. And like Musgrave looks good. He looks the part, but there's a lot of pieces there, and maybe he'll develop more quickly than I expect. But maybe it'll be Jaden. It's as likely to be Jaden Reed or, that rises up from the rookie ranks there as the slot receiver there in Green Bay.
Yeah, and I know he's not a rookie, but I want to throw Jake Ferguson's name into the mix here. Toss and I are big Cowboys fans.
Yeah.
Listen, I mean, if there's one thing that we know is that the Cowboys are going to incorporate the tight end into the offense. They've almost always did it. They had Jason Witten for a long, long time. Then Dalton Schultz kind of came out of nowhere, and I'm like, ooh, wow, this guy looked pretty good. He's becoming a top 10, top 12 tight end. Jake Ferguson, I think, is that guy this year that you can get late. And honestly, I think I'd probably draft him over all of the rookie tight ends. Maybe Kincaid is close, but I'd probably draft him over all the rookie tight ends. So Jake Ferguson is a player that if you're looking for a tight end too late in drafts this weekend, folks, or on Labor Day, you want to make sure you go out and grab him. He's not going to be as expensive as, and I don't know that any of these guys are going to be ultimately expensive, but like Bob mentioned, Greg Dulcich, Chigakonkwo,
Juwan Johnson. There's
handfuls. I mean, they're probably going to go in the higher late rounds, if that makes sense. Whereas like Ferguson's going to be a lottery ticket somewhere at the end of your draft. How many drafts do we have going on this weekend, guys?
3.
You got 3? Toss, what do you got?
For some reason, all of my buddies thought that Labor Day should just be a day of rest, and they're all on Tuesday and Wednesday. So
I labor on Labor Day, man. Bob labors on Labor Day. There is no Labor Day for us. It's the first damn week of the football season, for crying out loud. With that being said, make sure you guys subscribe and maybe give us a few positive comments. I know Bob was on the show this week, so that being said, we love Bob Harris. Make sure you hit us up. And of course, it's the Believe Fantasy Football Show with Michael Fabiano, yours truly. And we will continue to be releasing shows on Tuesdays and Fridays. And next week, we're going to be talking about players you can pick up off the waiver wire because it's that time of the year. Start looking at a few matchups. And then on Fridays, start them and sit them. And of course, you can find all that content over at Sports Illustrated, SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio. Lindsey Rhodes and I will be rocking out 1 to 3 Eastern time every single day, helping you out. And Bob Harris, tell the good folks where they can find you, except for basically everywhere.
Everywhere. Look for Football Diehard on all your social media platforms. On the YouTube, I do a couple live streams every single week on SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio and NFL Radio. I do the Saturday night show there. So check it out. All available. Football Diehard.
Football Diehards, and he dies hard when it comes to fantasy football. Bob Harris, you are the man. Thanks so much for joining us this week. Tash, you're the best. We will talk to you next week here on the Believe Fantasy Football Show with myself, Michael Fabiano, your friendly neighborhood fantasy football analyst who is going to help you take home a championship this season. We'll see you next week. Have a great Labor Day weekend, everybody.